So, Lord Monckton, what do you hope to add to the climate debate by coming to New Zealand?
The first thing is that I don't go anywhere unless somebody asks me to come. And various groups kindly asked me to come to New Zealand, having heard I was in Australia, and wondered if I could hop across the Tasman Sea while I was in the area. As it happened, it fitted in with my timetable very well, and so I'm delighted to be, for the first time ever, in New Zealand. And my main aim is, first of all, simply to speak to those who want to come and hear the other side of the case on global warming. And the two main points that I've been making at the very well-attended meetings here are, first of all, that we're not going to expect very much global warming over the next century, possibly as little as 1 Celsius for the doubling of CO2 concentration, which I expect to happen over the century. It will cause some warming, about 1 Celsius, but not much more than that. And the other message is that even if it were to cause the 3.3 Celsius of warming, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's central estimate over the next 100 years, then it would still be many, many times cheaper and more cost effective to sit back and do nothing and enjoy the sunshine than it would be to try to spend any money at all now on trying to make global warming go away.
Who has paid for your trip to New Zealand?
The pennies of the poor. Most of my trips of this kind, there will be a few citizens who dig into their pockets to buy the tickets and book the venues and make sure that transport is available. And then, because large numbers of people come to the venues and pay to hear the talks, that usually covers the expenses just about exactly. There's very little money on the sceptical side of the climate debate. There's billions upon billions on the other side, but we don't have lots of money on our side. So this tour, like the Australian tour, will be paid for by kind donations from a few ordinary concerned citizens, but mostly from the contributions made on the door by people coming to hear what I have to say.
So, how do you answer the fact that you're not a climate scientist?
Well, I have to admit that I'm not a climate scientist, but I am a mathematician, and a reasonably competent one. I got a degree at Cambridge in classical art and architecture, which included quite a thick chunk of mathematical knowledge. And I've studied quite a bit of mathematics since and made a lot of money at it since. So, for instance, I invented the Eternity puzzle, which became Puzzle of the Year in Australia when we launched it here. It was my first visit to Australia about 15 years ago, when I came across to launch the Eternity puzzle. And we sold shed loads of them. And this was a puzzle with 209 pieces and no picture. And the first person to put all the pieces in the frame so that they didn't overlap or have any gaps between them would win £1 million. And eventually somebody did win the £1 million. It took 18 months though, and by that stage we'd sold 500,000 puzzles at £30 each. So finding the £1 million for the prize wasn't too difficult. So I have a mathematical background, and I have an interest in poking my nose into things that are really not my business. I suppose every policymaker is a bit like that, a bit arrogant if you like. And so when I was invited by a merchant bank in London, or not a merchant bank, a little boutique finance house, I should say, in London, to have a look at the global warming question 5 years ago and tell them what I thought, I spent a month on it, realised that what we had all thought 25 years previously, when I had first briefed Margaret Thatcher on it at number 10, that there might be a problem. We now pretty much knew that there wasn't going to be one, but by then so many people were making lots of money out of pretending that there was a problem that I thought this scare would run and run, which I think it will, but for not very much longer. Astonishingly, ordinary people have not allowed themselves to be fooled by this. Initially, several of them did, but now they're waking up to the fact that this story has been overblown. And Margaret Thatcher, like me, we both revised our opinions on this independently over the last few years, came to the conclusion that this had been oversold and that there really isn't much of a problem with the climate, and therefore the view that she has and has expressed in her autobiography, so I'm not revealing any confidences here, are my views, which are that we don't have as big a problem as anyone on the other side has suggested. Even if we did, there's nothing that makes any economic sense to do about it. It is better just to sit back, enjoy the sunshine and adapt in a focused way, if and when and where, and only to the extent that any adverse consequences may occur as a result of any future global warming that may occur.
So what did you find when the boutique financier asked you to have a look at the whole question of global warming?
I spent a month looking at it, at his expense, and had a really good and thorough look. I talked to scientists on both sides of the debate. I had a completely open mind on it. I mean, I had no vested interest either way. I just wanted to know what was true so that I could tell him. He was an old friend. He wanted to know what was my best opinion on it. He had absolutely no desire to point me in one direction or another. I had no political or other predilection in one way or another. I simply wanted to know, was there a problem or wasn't there? And when I looked at the material, I spent a month rootling about, and I collected dozens of scientific papers, and I did some equations and graphs. I even set up a tiny climate model myself to look at certain aspects of this problem. And my firm conclusion was that although we had all thought 20, 30 years previously that there might be a problem, it was now pretty much known that there wasn't going to be one, but that so many people had piled in and were making money out of pretending there was a problem, that the scare was not going to go away in a hurry. So I told the financier this, and I said, here's my 40-page report summarising all the graphs, equations, papers, references, background diagrams, temperature records, you name it. It was all in there. And he rang up a couple of weeks later. He said, I've consulted a dozen people. You're the only one that says there isn't a problem. Why should I pay any attention to you? And I said, well, of course, you shouldn't. Science isn't done like that. I've produced the evidence as best I can assemble it in the time. I think it's a fair representation of the position. If there's anything that you think I have got wrong or exaggerated or missed out or misunderstood or misstated, please feel free to say so. I'll have another look and get back to you with an answer. Otherwise, I've told you what I think, and I've told you why I think it, and I've given you the evidence, and you must form your view. And he said, don't worry, we're going with you and not the other 11. And I said, why is that? He said, because you're the only one that offered any evidence at all. All the others just said, you have to believe. And he said, I didn't get where I am today by believing stuff. I got there by checking stuff. And you've checked it. We've checked out one or two of the points you mentioned. We've found them to be true. So we have good reason to suspect that you are telling the truth. Therefore, it's pretty clear to us that there isn't a problem with the climate, and that a lot of people are indeed trying to make money out of pretending that there is. We can see some opportunities while governments are subsidising this for us to make money out of the subsidies, but we will, as a result of your report, be very, very careful not to lock ourselves in too far or too deep or too permanently, because we know how fickle governments can be, and when they work out what you've worked out, which is that there is no scientific problem, and even if there were, economically there's no sense in doing anything about it, then they will pull the plug on these subsidies, and we're not going to get caught. So he was very grateful. And he said, could you pass on your report, he said, to the editor of the Sunday Telegraph? So I said, well, yeah, sure, if you like. So I sent it to her, and she rang and said, but this is fantastic, it's detailed, it's fascinating, but how can I print 40 pages of equations in my paper? I said, well, of course you can't. I'll write you a 1,000-word sampler to show you the kind of thing that could be said. And eventually she said, well, all right, do me 2,500 words on the science and we'll print it. So I did. And within 2 hours of the Sunday Telegraph going live on the internet on the Saturday night at midnight, within 2 hours they had had 127,000 hits to the Sunday Telegraph's webpage, and it crashed for the first and only time in its history. The most popular article they have ever printed, and they never let me write again. Why? Not because it wasn't popular, because it was, but because the usual suspects then got onto them and said, this man is not a scientist, he knows nothing about it, his article is full of mistakes. It wasn't actually the 1 or 2 minor things, but nothing you'd write home about. And therefore you shouldn't ever listen to him again. And the Telegraph, frightened by this barrage of criticism from the Greens and the left, backed off, and now will very seldom allow anyone other than Christopher Booker, their long-time columnist, to write on the other side of the case. And it was he, in fact, who came to this subject by reading that article by me. And he said to me the other day, he said, I only switched from attacking Europe to attacking global warming when I saw your piece about global warming and realised just how much this was going to cost the West if we allowed it to continue. So that was how I first put my head above the parapet publicly, if you like. It was in the Sunday Telegraph. And I was immediately and very savagely attacked by the left in public. The Guardian, which is a Marxist daily newspaper, had one of its columnists who likes to call himself a scientist, but he's actually a 14th-rate zoologist who knows far less climate change than I do and knows no mathematics at all. He wrote an 1,800-word rant saying this person is just a peer of the realm who doesn't even have a seat or a vote. He knows no science. He was trained in the classics. I'm a scientist. I know better. He got it wrong. And in fact, I had got it right, and it was the Marxist journalist who'd got it wrong. And I made the Guardian print an apology and retraction in the form of a letter by me answering all these scientific points that he'd got wrong. And neither he nor they have ever forgiven me, because apparently it was the only time this particular so-called self-appointed expert on global warming had ever been seriously challenged and successfully challenged. And so he and they were absolutely furious that he, as their big star hero environmental reporter, had been brought low. And they have never lived it down, and they've never let me forget it. And they write venomous, poisonous little attacks on me every 2 or 3 weeks. And this has been very much a feature of this debate ever since I got into it, that the extreme left, I call them the Marxists or the communists or the fascists or whatever name you want to call them, the totalitarians, let's settle for that, the étatistes, the dirigistes, the people who want to interfere in every little minutiae of your life. These people have been attacking me with a savagery that I've never seen on any other subject. I've never been such a punchbag as I am today. And I take this in some ways as a rather backhanded compliment, because what they're saying is that the science I'm doing and the economics I'm doing, the results are so uncongenial to them that they will do anything, however unprincipled, to try to damage or destroy my reputation so as to prevent the scientific truth or the economic truth from getting out into the public. Well, they aren't going to stop me that way, and I think by now they've begun to realise it, but the shrieking and the shrillness of the attacks on me, and of course others like me who have the same message, continue unabated.
So what exactly have they got so wrong? What are you saying the warmists have got so wrong about global warming?
Well, the first thing that they've got wrong is they try to say that there is a consensus, that the science is settled, and that therefore nobody is allowed to argue an alternative point of view. Free speech, forget it. They don't believe in the concept. They say that the science is settled. Now, of course, it can't be settled. Why? Because the climate is a mathematically chaotic object. At no particular provocation at all, it can spin off in one direction or another. You get a sudden extreme weather event, and there's no way we can predict that. There's no way you can attribute it to global warming. It's been happening for 4,567 million years since that first Thursday on which the Earth began. There's no basis whatsoever for saying that the science is settled. It cannot be settled as far as the climate is concerned. And yet that is universally what many, even who are scientists and who ought to know better on the extreme left, are saying. So the first thing is there is no consensus about the point that really matters, which is the how much warming point, the climate sensitivity question, as the scientists call it. How much warming will we get if we double the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the next century? And the official answer to that is between 2 and 4.5 Celsius, with a best estimate of 3.25. The amount that I think right, based on not only my own calculations but also on a considerable amount of papers in the peer-reviewed literature who have done where the scientists have done their evaluations of the question, not by mere modelling, not by Xbox 360s and PlayStations with zitty teenagers messing about with them, but instead by proper measurement, observation and experiment and the application of established theory to the results. That's how science should be done. Those scientists who've done it that way, and there are only a few dozen in the world who have ever studied this how much warming question in proper physical and mathematical detail, they have mostly come to the conclusion that we will get a very little warming from a doubling of CO2 concentration, and the typical estimate is actually less than 1 Celsius degree. And that is entirely in line with my own calculations, which I first published in a scientific paper peer-reviewed by Professor Alvin Saperstein of Wayne State University, who was the review editor of the journal in question, and published, it was in the Journal of Physics and Society, in July 2008. And the conclusion I came to is that we were looking at less than 1 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2 concentration. And of course anything less than about 2.5 Celsius of warming is not going to be a problem. And indeed, it's quite difficult really to foresee that even the sort of 3 or 4 or 5 Celsius that they're expecting to happen would in fact be dangerous either. There's been an awful lot of exaggeration both of the amount of warming that we would expect and then of the amount of damage that this warming might do.
Have you done any costings at all about the effect of what happens if we don't or if we do put all these taxes in place?
That's a very good question, and the first economists to look at this concluded in the peer-reviewed literature that it was more expensive to do anything about global warming at all than it was simply to let it happen, adapt in a focused way to its consequences and put up with it and endure the cost. And then came the Stern report of 2006. Now this was not peer-reviewed, it was a government propaganda report done by an economist that they could rely on to come up with the result that they wanted. And what he did, he used 3 or 4 tricks, and I'll just mention some of them. First of all, the UN's climate panel, as its central estimate, says that for a doubling of CO2 concentration, the sort of thing we'd expect by the end of the 21st century, there would be a warming of 3.26%. That's the central, 3.26 Celsius, I should say. That's the central estimate, 3.26 Celsius by the end of this century, if you have a doubling of CO2 by the end of this century. Now, Stern came along and said, no, it's going to be, as a central estimate, 50% higher. We're going to call it 5 Celsius. Garneau would then do the same in his own report 2 years later on the Australian economy and climate change. So you've got this huge 50% exaggeration, this 50% uplift in the central estimate of warming that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had originally estimated. So that was exaggeration number 1. Exaggeration number 2 was he said, right, if you get this amount of warming, this exaggerated amount of warming, we will then exaggerate the amount of damage that that exaggerated amount of warming would cause. So he hugely exaggerated the amount of damage that that warming would cause. And then the third thing, and this was the real killer, instead of using the correct intertemporal discount rate, which is a way that economists use of working out whether you should spend money now on something or leave it to future generations to spend it later, what you do is you try to work out what is the cost or benefit to us now of waiting and letting our successors do it later. And they use a discount rate so that the further towards the future you go, the less it matters to us what they do about things. And this is perfectly common sense, and the normal discount rate that you would use for this purpose, of course, is broadly speaking equal to the minimum real rate of return on capital that you would expect if you invested the capital now. If you invested it now for 40 years, let's say, if you're looking 40 years ahead, and then you would expect to get, as a real rate of return on capital, at least 5%, not worth investing it otherwise, because it's just not going to give you a big enough return. So 5% is the minimum appropriate discount rate for intergenerational comparisons, intergenerational appraisals as they're called. Should we invest now? Should we leave it to our kids and our grandkids to do it? So Stern, instead of taking 5% as the rate, or even taking the 3.5% central rate which the HM Treasury, of which he was a civil servant in the UK, would recommend, he decided he would take a 0.1% discount rate. And this meant he could get away with saying that the cost of making global warming go away would be 1% of 21st century GDP. But the cost of not making it go away and doing nothing and then taking the climate damage would be between 5 and 20% of GDP, and it might even be more, he said. Really huge figures. Now, so what I did in looking at this was I said to myself, okay, this is the most extreme report I can find. So what we'll do is we'll keep his exaggeration of temperature change as a result of a doubling of CO2, we'll keep his consequent, even larger exaggeration of the amount of warming that even that exaggerated temperature change will cause. We'll keep those. We'll pretend he was right on those. But we will just correct for the discount rate on which he's so plainly wrong that the entire economic literature doesn't agree with him. And we will use the 5% rate that is appropriate, and which Václav Klaus, the President of the Czech Republic, actually mentioned as the correct rate in a talk that he gave to the press club in Canberra in Australia just a couple of weeks ago, and a week after I had given a talk on the same subject and had come to the same conclusion. So he recommends a 5% rate. And so if you apply that to Stern's calculations, instead of the 0.1% rate that he chooses of discount, then the cost of doing nothing about global warming and taking the damage that arises, even the exaggerated damage that arises, comes down from Stern's 5 to 20% of 21st century global GDP to just 0.4 to 1.5%. And frankly, once you see that figure, you realise that actually there's no point in doing anything about global warming anyway, because the damage cost, even if it happens in a much exaggerated way, is simply not worth doing anything about. It's not large enough to worry about. So then you have to look at the other side of the equation, which is what is the economic cost of taking action on climate change? Well, there again, Stern says it's only going to be 1% of GDP. But if we take, say, the Australian and New Zealand ETS schemes as an example of how much this might cost, then the cost of trying to make go away the 0.23 Celsius of global warming over the next 10 years, which the IPCC, broadly speaking, expects will happen as its central estimate, the cost of making that go away and not happen, if you worldwide had ETS schemes the same way as you have here in New Zealand and they're about to have in Australia, would be, get this, 60% of GDP, compared with the 0.4 to 1.5% of GDP that would be the cost of doing nothing. In other words, at the correct discount rate, it's 40 times more expensive to make global warming go away by having these ETS schemes and all the other taxes and regulations and costs that are being imposed on people than it is to do nothing, sit back and enjoy the sunshine. And that's before you take into account, what's called the opportunity cost, the opportunity loss of diverting the money that you would otherwise spend on useful investments or helping the poor in Africa, whatever it might be. Instead, you're spending on this complete nonsense of making global warming go away, which even if it was a problem, which I don't think it is, then that's how much more expensive it would be to do something about it than it would to do nothing about it. It's about 40 times more expensive to make it go away. And even then, only if you believe the IPCC when it says how much warming we're going to get. So the best thing to do, as far as the science is concerned, is not to worry, because it's just not been warming at a fast enough rate over the last 50 or 60 years to justify the very extreme predictions of future rates of warming that are now being made by the IPCC. And every year that passes, this becomes more and more glaringly obvious to honest scientists. Even if they were right, it's still best to sit back and do nothing and let it happen.
Would we make it go away anyway?
No.
Okay. You're in New Zealand now, and I know you're going to be talking to some farming audiences.
Yes.
Would you like to comment? I know there's a number of people very concerned about the ETS as it applies to farming in New Zealand.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, you're being clobbered by, as farmers, by having to pay a lot more for fuel and electricity. And of course, you're heavy users of both. It goes with the territory, being in the country, running agricultural machinery, having to drive to and from. These extra costs of fuel and of electricity are already very burdensome. And when I was told by somebody this afternoon that agriculture wasn't in the ETS, I said, well, A, it is in the ETS because it has to pay these savage extra costs on its business. And secondly, they're about to introduce a scheme, or rather a scam, by which every cow and sheep is going to be taxed on its weight as a proxy for how much methane it is thought to emit. Methane being 23 times more potent as a greenhouse gas even than CO2 is. Now, this is an entirely misconceived tax on farmers, an additional burden, which is entirely unnecessary. How do I know? Because as a layman, I check things in the rather plodding and straightforward and unexciting way that laymen check things. I simply looked up and said, right, in the last decade, how much has the atmospheric concentration of methane increased? And it's gone up. Oh yes, it's gone up by 18 parts per billion. And if you multiply that by, say, 23 or 21, which is the figure that your government uses for the global warming potential compared with CO2, and then you use the CO2 warming formula that the IPCC uses, then the amount of warming that is going on at the rate at which we're adding methane to the atmosphere over the last 10 years is the equivalent of 0.02 Celsius per century. That is 1/50th of a Celsius degree over a whole century. That is how little methane is actually contributing as things go along just over this decade. It is a ridiculously small amount. And so if you know that it's a ridiculously small amount, even if you were to double the atmospheric concentration of methane in the same way as we expect we'll double the CO2 concentration. Now, first of all, there is no physical basis for assuming that we ever would double the output of methane, but even if we did, the amount of global warming this would cause is negligible because there's so little of it in the atmosphere anyway. It's only present at sort of 1.7 parts per million compared with CO2 with 390 parts per million. So even if you multiply that 1.7 by, let us say, the 21 that they're talking about, you're still not going to get much above sort of 40 or 50 parts per million of CO2, which is, it's roughly 25 years of CO2. At absolutely most, that's if you could double the methane in the atmosphere. That's not going to happen. So frankly, looking at methane, just because it has a global warming potential 23 times that of CO2, is not important given that the atmospheric concentration of methane isn't rising very much. And because it was rising a lot until 1999 and has then levelled off, whereas the number of cattle in the world has remained broadly constant over the period, we know that these fluctuations up and down in the concentration of methane are nothing to do with cattle. They are therefore probably having only a very, very small effect on global temperature. And certainly so small that we can't actually measure it and wouldn't even able to measure it after a whole century. So we can take methane and therefore all cows and sheep right out of the equation. It's simply not sensible to tax them and to penalise the very industry on which surely New Zealand was built. Where did everybody start when they came here? They started with farming. And to kick the farmers in the teeth, as is now being proposed, has absolutely no scientific justification behind it whatsoever.
Thank you. I understand you've got some issue with NIWA and their temperature records. Would you like to tell us about that?
Well, here it's not for me to lead the charge, but I know that certain groups here in New Zealand have said that they're upset with NIWA having tampered with the temperature record over the last 100 years, so that instead of showing virtually no increase in global temperature or in New Zealand temperature over the period, what they're doing is they are showing an increase that's 3 or 4 times larger. And there's no real scientific basis for this. And when they asked NIWA to explain, NIWA wouldn't explain. And so eventually they said, well, if you won't explain and we're paying for you by our taxpayers' money, then we'll go to court to make you explain. And so they're going to court, and as a result, I understand NIWA are beginning to crack and say, okay, we'll tell you how we did it. And so we will eventually, I think, get NIWA to redo this and do it properly this time. And it's not as though they're the only ones. The Australians have been tampering with their data, the Americans have been tampering with theirs, the British have been tampering with theirs. People have been having a high old time rewriting both the regional and global temperature data to try and make it look as though there was more global warming in the 20th century than there actually was. Why do they do this? Well, simply because what they're trying to do is to make out that if there was more warming then we're going to get even more warming in the future, and it'll all be worse than we could ever think possible. In fact, there's no truth in this. And I am inclined to think that the way to deal with these frankly fraudulent messings around with the scientific data to do with climate change. It's not necessarily the best place to deal with this in the civil courts. I think it's time that one or two people had their collars felt and were taken to the criminal courts by the prosecutors for the downright fraud which has been going on in too many areas of climate science. And although it's not for me to say that NIWA has actually committed fraud, it is very clear to me that some of their records appear to be rather bent, shall we say. This may well be simply because I'm too ignorant as a layman to understand it, but if so, I'm by no means the only one, which is why, as I understand it, this court case has been brought. And I shall watch with interest to see what happens. I would be prepared to bet quite large amounts of money that NIWA will not let it go anywhere near a court, because the one time there was a genuinely adversarial court case in the UK, it happened in 2007, was when some friends of mine took Al Gore's movie to court. They took the Department of Education in the UK to court to try and stop his movie being shown unless corrections were made. And that was a genuinely adversarial action, with the Met Office taking the side of Al Gore and the government, and us taking the other side. And there was a real fight. I wrote the scientific testimony for the sceptical side. Of course, it couldn't go in my name, because the usual thing, not a scientist, not a scientist. They don't ask Al Gore that ever, but they do always ask me. So what I did instead was to get two very eminent scientists, one of them was Bob Carter from down here, to sign off on the testimony that I had written, which they did, all 80 pages of it, with very, very few changes. And it was that testimony that broke the case. The moment the other side saw this scientific testimony with these two great names of Dick Lindzen from MIT and Bob Carter from James Cook University on there, you know, the greatest atmospheric physicist and the greatest geologist probably on the planet today, they caved in quickly, paid the plaintiff, I think it was £250,000 sterling in costs, and agreed that they would circulate 77 pages of corrective guidance. So I'm beginning to think that although you can win civil cases, as we did there, it's better not to take the risk and the cost, and instead, where there is a plain fraud, and I'm not saying that NIWA is in that territory, I haven't looked that closely, but where there is a plain fraud, then it should be reported to the police, and a demand should be made, preferably with a number of credible complainers agreeing to take part in it, that this fraud should be thoroughly investigated and the fraudsters, if necessary, put on trial for gaining grants and status and jetting around the world on behalf of the IPCC, when in fact they are doing so, at least in part, on the basis of evidence that has simply been fabricated, made up, falsified, bent.
Now, a number of people who don't like what you're saying have attempted to create some distractions, particularly in the time that you were in Australia before you came here.
Yeah.
And the two that spring to mind are the "Are you a lord or are you not a lord?" And the Nazi, the swastika incident. So can you tell us a little bit about both of those?
All right, let's start, because they happened in sequence. Let's start with where I described one of Ross Garnaut's opinions. Now, Ross Garnaut is the professor of economics who advises the Australian government on climate change economics. Doesn't know any climate change, but he doesn't know that much economics either, from my point of view. But anyway, there he was. He was the expert. He's got a lot of experience in economics. And he had said in his report to the Australian government that if you're not a climate scientist, as he is not, then it is your duty to defer to the authority of those who are, and the great scientific institutions who are all, he said, wrongly, unanimous on this. The Royal Society has, as you know, stepped out of line on this now and has come a long way in our direction by saying we actually don't know how much warming we're going to get in the climate. Much, much more honest than the others. But he says we must defer to authority. Now, I was giving a talk in California to a group of 150, some of whom were the leading Zionists in the United States. The Israelis who ultra Jewish in their feelings and their attitudes and in their fear of what the Muslim world is trying to do to them, and so forth, all the Zionist bit, if you like. They're very nice people, but they are quite strong in their views. And one of the things that they have long worried about is whether the fascism, which eventually turned nasty and killed 6 million of their ancestors, should arise again under some other guise. It's not going to be called fascism. You're not going to have people walking around in jackboots anymore, doing goose-stepping. That's not what's going to happen. But they're worried that nevertheless this rampant totalitarianism of the anti-democratic kind, because that's the distinction between fascism and communism. Communism pretends to be democratic. Well, it isn't. Fascism is openly anti-democratic. So the EU, for instance, is essentially a fascist organisation because it is anti-democratic, and irreformably so. Well, Ross Garnaut's remark was one of a series of remarks that I started with Hitler, saying, we must not allow the people to have a vote on things. They must accept the authority of the governing class, the best people who will be in the government. Government by the best people is, of course, aristocracy, but he wasn't talking about the old gentlemen like me who have inherited their titles. No, he was talking about the best people, those who conformed to the party line. And he was saying that those should govern and everybody else should defer to their authority. And so I then took various quotations from some of the people on the other side of the climate science debate, true believers in any religion. One of them, Schirmer from Australia, was saying, we have to end democracy for the sake of saving the planet. We can't trust you, the people, because you, the people, are not to be trusted. You just look after your own interest and you don't care about the interests of the planet. We know best, so we will tell you what to do and you must defer to our authority. And then along comes Dr. Hamilton, also of Australia, the Australia Institute, and he said, you must once again end democracy. We can't have democracy anymore for the sake of saving the planet. So then I had a quotation from Ross Garnaut saying, we must defer to authority. If we're not climate scientists, we must listen to what the climate scientists say and do what they tell us. Defer to the authority of the best people. Hitler's very words almost were the words that he had used. So, of course, I didn't say he was a Nazi, nor did I say he was a fascist. I said that that opinion that he had expressed was a fascist opinion. And because I had had a swastika on the Hitler slide, all the other slides that fitted in with the Hitlerian fascism and appeal to authority and you have to obey authority, I left the swastika on the screen and just changed the words and the names of the people it was talking about. So that's how Ross Garnaut came into the picture. And then I had a couple more quotations and then one more from Hitler saying that parliaments must never again be allowed to take any decisions. They are there merely to be the recruiting ground for our future leaders and debating chamber, but they must not have any power whatsoever to take any deliberative or vote of decision. That would be forbidden to them. And so I was saying here is this anti-democratic, openly anti-democratic stance. This is not communism, which would have said, well, we're going to pretend at democracy while actually doing it away. This is the open anti-democracy. We must bring democracy to an end. We must openly defer to authority and never mind what the people think. That is the hallmark of fascism. Now, in the context of the audience I was speaking to, this made perfect sense. And when I had finished that series of quotations, one after the other flashing on the screen, with the swastika there, I then added the words, let freedom ring, and stopped. That was the end of my presentation. And they leapt to their feet and gave me one of the most enthusiastic standing ovations I've ever had. Now that, of course, is not being revealed to the people here by the left. And what happened was that there was a disgruntled, defeated debating partner of mine who was a journalist from Australia called Graham Redfern, and I had absolutely wiped the floor with him at a debate at the Brisbane Institute 18 months previously, and ever since then he's been writing sniping comments about me, rather like Monbiot in The Guardian, who had tried to take me on climate science, and I'd made them correct that, and he'd never forgiven me and went on sniping. I mean, the left are like this. They're very, very mean-spirited. So when Redfern was hunting for something to do me damage with, because he knew I was coming to Australia, he found this sequence of slides and the standing ovation and so forth. All he took was the one slide with the remarks about what Garnaut had said on it, and put that all over the internet, all over Australia. And he had absolutely no regard at all, nor did anybody else of the left who immediately reproduced this, for the feelings of Ross Garnaut, who would never have known about it if it had stayed within the confines of the tiny audience that I'd given it to, and who would have entirely understood the context and would have realised I'm not saying he's a fascist, but I'm saying that it's these opinions that, if you allow them to spread, will lead to fascism just as they did before. So I said all this, and so Redfern spread all this all over Australia without any regard for Ross Garnaut's feelings, because he was much more interested in trying to humiliate me than worrying about whether he was going to humiliate Ross Garnaut. So I, of course, had to apologise rapidly, completely and abjectly, because I had not intended Ross Garnaut to have the whole world calling him a fascist, or saying that I'd called him a Nazi in the various ways that the left then exaggerated everything. So I apologised unreservedly to him, and then when the left and the press, and the two seem to be more or less synonymous sometimes, I think, these days, went on at me and on at me and on at me once I got to Australia, I held a press conference and I said, right, hands up, all those of you who, 2 weeks ago, when one of your number said that climate skeptics should be publicly branded with tattoos to show what their views were, how many of you asked that one of your fellow journalists to apologise? Did that journalist apologise as I unreservedly and humbly have? Hands up. No hand went up. And then I said, how many of you, last week, when one of your number on one of your largest national newspapers wrote in her column that climate skeptics should be gassed? I said, how many of you got in touch with her and said, you can't say that, you must apologise. It was the fascists who used to gas their opponents. We don't go around making fascist noises like that. How many of you? Hands up. Not a hand went up, and they looked about 3 inches high, and they were red-faced with shame. I said, right, how dare you apply this poisonous double standard, where because you're of the extreme left and I'm not, you come after me on the one occasion when an incautious and admittedly unsavoury remark by me was wrenched out of context, and then when your own, on your side of the case, do this far, far worse, calling for us actually to be killed by being put in a gas chamber, you have absolutely nothing whatsoever to say about it. You should be ashamed of yourselves. And that they were. There was no more trouble about that particular episode after that. But then I was interviewed by the ABC, which is an extreme left national broadcaster, rather like the BBC, but possibly even more poisonous than that. And there was a guy called Adam Spencer, who rang me up at 6:30 in the morning and said, I want to interview you. And I said, well, I'm awake now, so let's do it. And his first question was, are you a member of the House of Lords? So I said, yes, but without the right to sit or vote. He or somebody like him then got straight on to the House of Lords and said, he says he's a member of the House of Lords. They didn't add that I'd explained I didn't have the right to sit or vote. And then I got a letter from the clerk to the Parliament saying you mustn't go around saying you're a member of the House of Lords. And the clerk to the Parliament had the cheek to post this private letter to me on the House of Lords website, in flagrant defiance of the European Human Rights Convention that guarantees the right of the subject to privacy. So I was then asked by journalists in Canberra, can you tell us, was this man, the clerk to the Parliament, working in league with the international sort of climate left in Australia? And I had to say, well, all I can say is I have no knowledge of whether he was doing that, but he certainly will have known perfectly clearly from where the complaint must have come from that I was in Australia on a tour, and he was at the very least reckless as to whether or not he was in fact joining in with the left in trying to discredit me, and no clerk to the Parliament should behave in such an injudicious fashion, and the parliamentary authorities will be invited to investigate that matter when I get back. But then I got letters from 2 lawyers by email. One lawyer for a noble friend of mine who is also without the right to sit or vote, who had taken the government to court and had won the case to the extent that although they didn't actually say, yes, you can sit and vote, they did say that the letters patent created by the sovereign granting the peerage had not been extinguished by the act that purported to extinguish our membership of the Lords. And our membership of the Lords depends on those letters patent. And therefore, until the letters patent are extinguished by specific legislation, which we now have the court's authority for saying that they haven't been, we are and remain members of the House of Lords, whether the House of Lords authorities like it or not. And even if our interpretation and that of the QC, who wrote to me from out of the blue and said, you may like to know that you do indeed have the right to call yourself a member of the House of Lords, even if we are all wrong about that, in my day, it was believed that you had the right of free speech. And I haven't misled anybody as to what the House of Lords authorities thought. The moment that I first discovered that they didn't want me to say that I was a member of the House of Lords, I always made it plain that I didn't have the right to sit or vote, and I put it on the public record on no less a place than the record of Congress, before they even approached me about it, some years ago, that the House of Lords authorities differed with my interpretation. And nearly always I remember to say, though I didn't at 6:30 in the morning, that that's my interpretation and the House of Lords authorities disagree. And so that, I'm afraid it's a rather full and rather boring explanation. It's got nothing whatever to do with the climate. But one of the things I've learnt in this business is that what happens is the extreme left have learnt that they cannot meet me on the science and the economics. They know they will be defeated. And so they take a leaf out of the Saul Alinsky playbook. Saul Alinsky was a communist agitator in the United States who said, look, don't ever try to argue with these capitalist filthy pigs on matters of fact or of business or of economics or of science, because they always know more than you do. They will win. Instead, endlessly denigrate their reputation until everybody believes they have no reputation, and you will destroy them that way. And that's what they're trying to do to me. But it backfired, because as a result of those two episodes which you raised, my profile in Australia was raised, not in a way in which I would wish it to be raised, but it was raised to new heights. And as a result, whereas on the previous tour of Australia, the press club had refused me this 1 hour long televised national slot, this time they gave it to me, because I was now controversial enough to merit it. And so the left then saw, to their horror, that I was given this hour to debate with somebody from the Australia Institute who really wasn't very good. All he could say is, there's a consensus, in any case we must give the planet the benefit of the doubt and take out insurance just in case. And of course, as I said, first of all, there's no consensus. And even if there were, because science is not done by consensus, there's an old principle on the London insurance market which says that if the cost of the insurance premium exceeds the cost of the risk insured, don't take insurance. And that's a precautionary principle worthy of the name.
So, where to now in the fight?
Well, first of all, I'm not in a fight. At least, I suppose the left would like to think that I'm in a fight and I am lying on the floor bleeding from every orifice. But in fact, all I do is do what I did in coming to New Zealand. Some people said, will you come and communicate your research results to us? And I said yes, and I came and I communicated my research results to them. And it's really very straightforward. And if people are interested in hearing what I'm working on and what my conclusions are, then I'll continue to go wherever I'm wanted and attend meetings and answer questions and give presentations. That, I'm afraid, is all I do. I don't run a Twitter account, whatever that may be, and I don't do all sorts of other social networking things that no doubt people think I should, because I'm not, in fact, a propagandist. I'm not a campaigner. I'm not on a mission. I'm simply little old me, a layman, doing his best to understand the climate science and the economics that are related to it, because it interests me, and because I think there is a huge danger to the West in this. The late Eric Ellington, who was a founder of Greenpeace, was a great friend of mine, a very nice, gentle, totally non-political soul, lived on the northeast Nuke of Buchan in Scotland, landscape photographer, a true environmentalist, and he was one of those who set up Greenpeace to be an environmental organisation. And then, after a few years, he said, one day, we all left. And I said, why? This was a huge initiative you took, very successful. He said, well, no, the trouble is it was then that the Marxists, when the Berlin Wall came down, they all infiltrated the environmental movement because they had already decided, I think, he said, that this was the way to go, to try and undermine the economies of the West from within. and get them to cave in and shut down so that we in Russia and all those other places could compete. That was their thinking, he said. And so he said it was taken over by Marxists. And I said, well, forgive me, Eric, but you're not a very political person. This is very strong language for somebody who isn't a political person. He said, well, I'm absolutely furious that our organisation was captured by these people. It is no longer an environmental organisation. He said, a lot of the people who join it think it is, but it isn't. It's now a Marxist organisation dedicated utterly to the destruction of the West from within. And this was an extraordinary thing for him to say. And so I often talk about this, and I say, well, this is the view. He died, sadly, a few months ago. Lovely man. But that was his view. And it was also the view of Patrick Moore, another of the founders of Greenpeace, who's been in public and said that the Marxists have taken over. And so I think we are now dealing with a politically motivated rather than environmentally motivated concern about the climate. And it is therefore important to see the danger to the West in all this, because you don't hear the Greens, either here or in Australia, getting onto your largest trading partner, which is China, and saying, we want you to clean up your act. We've already cleaned up our act in the West, very largely. Our environment is now a very pleasant place compared with almost anywhere else in the world. But what do the Greens do? They're still trying to shut us down rather than sorting out the pollution in China, India, Africa, South America, where it is hundreds or even thousands of times worse than it is anywhere in the West. And it's that asymmetry between them always coming after us when we've already cleaned up our act and never going after the communist Chinese, for instance. This is deeply suspicious. And if we're not careful, because of the dumbing down of the population, which has allowed this fatuous storyline to be too readily and too widely believed, then we could shuffle by accident almost from the age of enlightenment and reason in which I was born, in which no such scare could have lasted 5 minutes, and into a new dark age. And I don't want that.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think people don't question as much as they used to?
Education is the problem. From the Middle Ages, when the Renaissance began, until my generation, and I was the last flicker, if you like, of the Renaissance spirit, not I personally, but my generation, everyone who aspired to play any part in the government of their nation, anywhere in Europe, was exposed to three particular kinds of education. First, a classical education, to teach us that in logic and in reason there is a distinction between good and bad, between right and wrong, between that which is so and that which is not so. A scientific education to teach us in the physical world which is which, and a religious education to make absolutely sure that we understood why that distinction matters. All these three forms of education are now an extreme rarity. Even the scientific education is far rarer than it should be. Most people do a tiny bit of science at school, but they never get to the level where they're going to study the scientific method, the philosophy of science, the natural philosophy, which led to the evolution of one of the most elegant forms of thought that man has ever come onto, which is science. They never get that. They're never taught it. They're certainly hardly ever taught religion in schools now. And as for the classics, well, 1 in 1,000 maybe, if you're lucky. As a result, most people who come out of school and university these days are not educated in any sense that would have been recognised in any previous generation from mine all the way back to the Middle Ages. It's as though they have not been to any kind of school at all. And therefore they are the prey of anyone who can put on a white coat and say, I'm the scientist here, you're the layman, I say we've got a problem, give me another grant, please. And unless you have some idea of how to check whether what they're saying to you is true, and some willingness to try to check, then you'll simply find yourself accepting, in which case you might as well hand the government of the world away from democratic or dictatorial regimes and hand it over to the men in white coats, the scientists, and just say, okay, we'll let you govern the world because we don't understand what we're doing and you pretend that you do. So it's a very, very dangerous deference, once again, to authority. It's a fascistic deference to authority that's going on. The people in white coats are the best people, so we're being told. They're the ones that should govern us. They're the ones that should decide. Now, the fact that they don't in fact agree with one another is quietly suppressed in this conversation. The fact that there's now a growing number of scientists, even in the climate field, who fundamentally disagree with the extremist notions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is never revealed by the media. The facts that point to the fact we don't have an alarming deterioration in the climate, never mentioned in the media. Instead, we only get one side of the story, and this is succeeding to some extent. I think it's not going to succeed in the end, because lies never do. The truth always wins out in the end, but damage can be done in the meantime, which is why it's good to try and get the truth back up there as quickly as we can. But it is this lack of education in those three vital subjects, the classics to tell us there's right and wrong, the sciences to tell us where that right and wrong divide is, and the religious education to tell us why that matters, that distinction. These three elements have gone from almost everybody's education. As a result, this uneducated political class that we have now is absolutely incapable of evaluating a scientific question in a logical fashion for itself, and is therefore utterly dependent on what it is told by the men in white coats. That is an extremely dangerous position. We therefore have to start right with our own children and make sure that one way or another they are given those three types of education. And as a precursor to those three types of education, before you even went to university in the medieval times, and indeed again up until my generation in the UK, you were taught three subjects which again are now not even there as a preliminary to university education, and they are first of all grammar, a detailed knowledge of how your own language hangs together, because language is the pathway of thought, then logic, which includes mathematics, straight thinking, to make sure that you think in a rational way and not in a purely emotional or biased or political way, but a rational way. That's logic. And the third bit was rhetoric. Once you have learnt your own language thoroughly and learnt how to think logically, then, and only then, you can exercise your will and express yourself in a way which will come across as logical and indeed as compelling and persuasive to others. And these are the essential elements in education. First of all, that medieval trivium of grammar and logic and rhetoric, and then the classical and scientific and religious education. Put all that back in place, and we can save the West from ultimate decay. Otherwise, dark age it is, and the world will be poorer, very much sadder for it.
Lord Monckton, thank you.
And thank you too.
Renton, we must save the planet. Sounds messianic. Save it from what? Sin? Exactly. The mortal, unforgivable sin of causing global warming, with hellfire and damnation for emitters.